Okay. Good afternoon. I am Beatrice Rangel, a board member of the Interamerican Institute for Democracy, entrusted with the task of conducting international relations. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our forum, Henry Kissinger and His Times, event that aims at assessing Dr. Henry Kissinger's legacy in international affairs. This event is part of our exchange agreement with the Universidad Peruana de Ciencias Aplicadas. We greet you from our headquarters, our former mayor of Miami, Don Tomás Regalado, and myself. The Interamerican Institute for Democracy is a private non-for-profit organization aiming at promoting and disseminating the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights, as well as institutional integrity in the Americas. Its members include scholars, politicians, workers, entrepreneurs, men and women of diverse nationalities. It is a non-partisan think tank that achieves its goals through academic research, seminars, colloquiums, and events in the context of pluralism and tolerance. Today, we are gathered around one of the most controversial statements in the past century, Henry Kissinger, who is turning 100 years old on May the 27th. To many, he provided President Nixon with the intellectual support to realize Nixon's vision of balance of power and detente. The Nixonian pillars built in tandem with Kissinger, reasoned his admirers, were at the root of the long period of peace and stability the world enjoyed for over 40 years. His critics, on the contrary, consider Dr. Kissinger to be a self-contained person with little imagination and simply an executor of Nixon's vision. His detractors consider him a less than heroic leader who chose to bomb innocent people for the sake of claiming victory over what was a lost cause in Vietnam. Neil Ferguson, his biographer, recently presented us with yet another view. Kissinger is an idealist that firmly believes in the proper use of diplomacy to avoid war and preserve peace. Which of these incantations will define his legacy? These questions are to be answered by our star-studded panel, Dr. Jorge Castañeda, Dr. Luigi Einaudi, and former President of Costa Rica, José María Figueres. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Today we shall cover the following program. We have the welcoming remarks from our President, Tomás Regalado, and the presentations of Dr. Castañeda, Dr. Einaudi, and President Figueres. The closing remarks will be delivered by Mariano Caucino, professor of the University of Buenos Aires, directly from Buenos Aires. Presenters will have 10 minutes to deliver their remarks. Tomás Regalado has been twice consecutive times the mayor of Miami. Prior to that, he unfolded a very successful career as journalist covering wars, conflicts, and the White House. Today, he enjoys high ratings both on radio as well as on TV. Don Tomás, please take the floor to initiate these proceedings.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Beatrice, because you were able to put this together. And this is important because next Monday, we will commemorate Memorial Day. This is the most solemn date in the U.S. calendar because we remember those who fought and died for freedom and democracy and for our way of life. And when you visit the history, the Vietnam War was one of the most controversial conflicts that the United States ever got involved in because of circumstances. And Henry Kissinger was the person that was able to end this nightmare for the society in the United States. Then every day we hear about China, and we all remember that was Dr. Kissinger who started the interaction with China. As a young a student of journalism. We will discuss current news and event, and always the name of Dr. Henry Kissinger was part of that conversation. Today we have a tremendous panel that would enlighten us to understand that personality and that era and that legacy. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Ambassador Einaudi. Thank you, Minister Castañeda. Thank you, Ambassador Caucino. We are looking forward of listening and seeing you to talk about history so we can plan the future.
Thank you so much, Don Tomás. Now I will call upon Dr. Jorge Castañeda. Jorge Castañeda is a Mexican politician and professor. Since earning his PhD, Castañeda has served as professor in a number of colleges and universities, including the University of California at Berkeley, Princeton University, New York University, the University of Cambridge, and the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He has served as advisor to the Mexican government on Central American and Caribbean affairs and as Secretary of Foreign Affairs. He has authored several books, including a biography of Che Guevara, then also another, Limits to Friendship, the United States and Mexico, written in cooperation with Robert Pastor, An Utopia Unarmed, the Latin American Left After the Cold War, and his autobiography, Amarres Perros. Most recently, he wrote a very successful book that is The U.S. as Seen by Foreigners. His writings have appeared in many news sources, including Mexico's Proceso en Reforma, the Los Angeles Times, Spain's El País, and Newsweek International. Welcome, Dr. Castañeda.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, Tomás, for this invitation. It's an honor to be both with President Figueres and with Luigi Einaudi, friends I've known for many years, and also with Mariano from Lima. I was asked to address the question of Kissinger in Latin America, and this is a topic I don't want to address, I think for good reason. I will try to explain in a couple of minutes why I don't want to address this topic, and then try to share with you a few thoughts on the Kissinger I would like to talk about. Why don't I want to talk about Kissinger in Latin America? Well, for a very simple reason. Inevitably, this is how history is written and told. Some events characterize a person or a country or a regime's performance at a given time in a given place. And Henry Kissinger in Latin America, unfortunately, will be recalled, I think, is recalled, and will be continued to be recalled for the policies that he advocated and implemented between September of 1970 and September of 1973 regarding Chile and the Allende regime. It's inevitable, if you talk about Kissinger and Latin America, to talk about Kissinger and Allende, Kissinger and Chile, Kissinger and the coup of 1973 that overthrew Allende. We can argue endlessly, and many scholars have, and they have enlightened us about all of these matters, about whether the coup came about because of Allende's incompetence, economic incompetence mainly, and the radicalization of people in the street, and the opposition or resistance of the Christian Democrats and the Chilean private sector, or whether it came about instigated by Nixon and Kissinger and the intelligence establishment, or either by actively promoting it or just winking and looking the other way. But this is such a sad episode in Latin American history and in US-Latin American relations, and has done so much harm to the American image in Latin America and Kissinger's image in Latin America, that if one dwells upon it, I think one is unable to really consider Kissinger's other enormous accomplishments in many other fields. There is obviously Kissinger, the statesman regarding Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union. The Vietnam chapter is a very complicated one. I'm sure Ambassador Einaudi will share his thoughts with us about it. Because yes, eventually peace came to Vietnam, but at a very high cost. And one can always argue whether that cost was so high because Kissinger made it so high for domestic political reasons, or whether it would have been higher had it not been him who was negotiating in Paris with Le Duc. In the case of the Soviet Union, one can always argue that the type of détente that he achieved with Brezhnev and with Gromyko did not last as long as it might have, because there was a lack of substance to it and a lack of capacity to implement. What obviously was a lasting achievement of Kissinger in government was the rapprochement between China and the United States. This was a historic event that has lasted until today, with all of the discussions and debates today about whether this is over or not over, whether there is now a new Cold War between China and the United States, whether China will invade Taiwan, etc. All of this discussion today, and it's an important discussion and a worthwhile one, goes back to the Shanghai Communique and goes back to the opening to China and goes back to Kissinger at least implementing it. And I would rather think that as any good team of a president and his foreign policy executor, there was a give and take, a back and forth. It's impossible to say who started the ball rolling, because as much as Kissinger might have conceived all of this in his mind, without Nixon as president to go through with it, it would never have happened. And perhaps Nixon, with another advisor or thinker alongside him, would not have had the boldness to go ahead and do what he did with China. But these are just 8 years of Kissinger's career. His service in government ended in early 1977. In fact, nearly half a century has gone by since then. It's hard to appreciate how much he has written, how much he has said, how much he has thought, what contacts he has made since then. And in many ways, I would like to think of him more as someone, as the Kissinger after power, after office, rather than the Kissinger of those 8 years in office. He has given us, of course, the White House memoirs, and then as Secretary of State, but many other scholarly works on diplomacy, as one is called, on China, which is a brilliant book written by a non-China specialist on China. Non-China specialist, of course, because he didn't speak Chinese and because he is not a China scholar in the strict sense of the word, but he probably knows more about China or has known more Chinese leaders and thinkers and practitioners than anyone else outside of China over the past 50 years. I think he has given us an enormous amount of reflection on all of these matters. And most recently, and I will just devote my last couple of minutes to this, this very interesting, fascinating, I would say, interview that he had with the Economist editorial board just this past Sunday on all sorts of issues, but in particular on Ukraine and on the rivalry between China and the United States, and how worried he is that things could come apart between China and the United States as each country perceives the other to be a real danger to it. And as he also sees Ukraine being a conflict which, of course, violates international law, violates the UN Charter. Yes, all of that is true, but at the same time, a conflict that has to be contained in order for it not to go beyond the bloody and tragic and terrible dimensions it already has achieved, but that could be much worse. If anyone wants to be familiar with Kissinger's thinking at its very best, I would say, I would strongly recommend this long interview in The Economist just this past weekend, which I think tells us a great deal about the world and about the United States. In a previous essay he published in The Economist, I think last year, in a series of pieces about the United States' role in the world, I was also invited to participate in that series. He made the point, as many of us also did, that perhaps one of the risks for the United States in its diplomacy and its role in the world lay domestically, more in what is happening, was happening, and will happen inside the United States than not only in its international projection. And I think this also tells us a lot about the quality, the scope of Kissinger's reflections on all of these matters. He has always written many insightful, intelligent, sometimes cynical things about the United States, but some of them are extraordinarily interesting, partly perhaps because he has always maintained a certain distance with his country of adoption. Thank you, Beatrice, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for having me here with such distinguished colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castañeda, for those brilliant remarks. I will now call upon Luigi Einaudi. Luigi Einaudi is a retired U.S. diplomat and educator. In 2000, Ambassador Einaudi was elected Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States and served also as Acting Secretary General from 2004 to 2005. At the OAS, Einaudi supported both the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Defense Board, and brokered negotiations to reduce border problems in Central America, to increase democratic space in Haiti, including the introduction of Haiti's first personal identity card. Ambassador Einaudi's 23-year-long State Department career culminated as the U.S. Special Envoy in the peace talks that led to a comprehensive settlement in 1998 by Ecuador and Peru of their century-old territorial conflict. Einaudi was one of the few people who was blessed with working directly with Dr. Kissinger and being part of his inner circle that conducted policies in the times when he was building detente and and while building the architecture for a more stable world. We welcome and we thank Ambassador Einaudi for being with us.
Thank you, Beatrice, very much for that kind introduction, and thank everyone for participating and allowing me to share a few ideas. Henry Kissinger and I both studied at Harvard, but we did not know each other there. I worked with him twice. Once for 4 years as a member of his policy planning staff when he was Secretary of State, 1973 to 77. And then again, I was the staff organizer for the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America which Kissinger chaired in 1983, 1984. And I will limit my comments mainly to my direct interactions rather than to some of the broader issues, simply in order to be able to fulfill Beatrice's assertion that I should give a sense of working with the man. I would say actually that the first thing about working with Henry Kissinger is that one had to learn to have a thick skin for his complaints, his unhappiness, and is willing to work you to death. He complained that everyone would always be criticizing him for the decisions he made last week, or instead, if they were going to be kind, telling him what he had to do this week. So his charge to us, the assignment he gave his planning staff, was to try to worry, to tell him what it was that he might have to do and face in the next 6 months. That meant, since government is difficult, often a matter of daily survival, it meant being home very late for dinner, to the point that I drove my own wife out of the house because she couldn't stand to sit there and wait for me all the time while the dinner got cold. And it led sometimes, it really did, to my getting a telephone call at midnight telling me that I had to have a revision of a paper I had written on Kissinger's desk by 6 o'clock in the morning. And that was before the days of teleworking or distant working or the kinds of things we do nowadays. It meant getting up, getting dressed, going to work in the office, etc., etc. I think I hold the record in Inter-American affairs for stays in Rio de Janeiro in luxury hotels on the beach without ever being able to go on the beach or feel the sand between my toes. Kissinger spent a lot of time worrying about speeches and about the value of words. Now, to a lot of cynics, speeches are just propaganda. For Kissinger, they were a way of escaping the limits of daily politics and trying to stretch the envelope to be able to gain a little bit of extra space and make policy better. This really did mean a great deal of work. It was not uncommon for us to spend 15 drafts of a speech. And I remember one occasion Kissinger complained. He said, "Why does it always take 15 drafts to get something that is reasonable?" And Winston Lord, who was the director of the staff, looked at him coldly and said, "Mr. Secretary, it would help if you had read the first 14. Sharp-tongued, impatient, often feared and disliked within the bureaucracy. One of the difficulties of working with Kissinger was that the old tradition of memorandums of conversation, because in government you don't want conversations of state to be left to go unrecorded. They simply allow for too many games to be played by too many people. But Kissinger would be furious with many of the notes that were sent to him of his conversations later, he would complain that the people who had taken the notes weren't qualified because they couldn't even understand what he was saying. And for me, this turned into a very useful thing because I was still a young and largely unproven officer at that point, and I was able to be present at many important meetings as the note taker, the invisible note taker. Kissinger was different from many others in the American system because he was fascinated and took advantage of differences in culture and history. He was really extremely interested in identifying what other people thought and how to convey his views in ways that they could understand. This personally, for me, meant extra work. I can remember staying up virtually all night in Mexico City, retranslating one of his speeches, working with a very nice lady who was a Spanish Republican exile, who would give me what she had translated, and I would fix it. I would correct it. I, the American visiting, would sit there and correct her Spanish. She held her breath for a while, but finally she exploded. She said, "Einaudi, you are making him sound like a Mexican." Well, you know, part of the point is to be able to communicate with the people that you're talking to. Now, we've all talked and we all think about ideology. And in today's world, as in Kissinger's world, ideology was very important. But I should say that it's important to note that Kissinger was really a very practical person, a pragmatic person in many, many ways. Jorge Castañeda has given what is, I think, the conventional view of what happened in Santiago in 1973. I would disagree with that analytically to a significant extent, but the mere fact that many people believe it, and many people believed it then, that the coup was engineered by the United States, created a hemispheric crisis. And it led Kissinger to launch something he called the New Dialogue in an attempt to identify how relations in the hemisphere could be improved. Now, his choice for doing that was to turn to one of Jorge's predecessors, Emilio Rabasa. Why did he go to Rabasa? Well, in part for the reasons that bedevil Mexico to this day. It is a neighbor of the United States and therefore has to be careful about how it behaves, but also because Kissinger had discovered that he could work with Rabasa, that they had, when Kissinger was at the White House in the NSC, been able to work together to solve some problems of the Rio Grande, of the Colorado River waters, where in effect the Americans were taking all the water and before it was even getting to Mexico and making life very difficult on that side. So Kissinger made the choice because he knew he could work with the person. And that, I think, is a very important aspect of Kissinger. He was careful to understand who he was working with and making his judgments about them. He was also adaptable. He was very adaptable. I will only mention one simple case. We went to Venezuela once, and I had prepared in his opening meeting, which is a reception that Carlos Andrés Pérez gave for him, a few talking points, which Kissinger threw away. And he spoke off the top of his head with Nixonian type reasoning about the special relationship and et cetera, et cetera. Afterwards, we met in the room of the American delegation, and Kissinger asked me in front of everyone, well, how did that toast go? And he was really very pleased and ready to be told that it was very good. And I said I wasn't going to tell him what I thought. I was going to tell him what one of the leading Venezuelans present had said to me. And that was that the United Fruit Company must have been really holding a loaded revolver against his head to get him to say such nonsense. Well, some of the people there were sure that my body would be floating headless in the river the next day. But from then on, Kissinger paid attention to what I had to say to him. In the 1980 presidential campaign, Kissinger was quoted as saying that Jimmy Carter had unleashed human rights policies on the world without knowing on what shores it would wash up and with what consequences. In that sense, Kissinger immediately identified himself as an enemy.
Luigi, you have 1 minute left.
Let me say that in the report of the National Bipartisan Commission, Kissinger made an effort to correct that. And he said, he wrote that experience has destroyed the argument of the old dictators that a strong hand is essential to avoid anarchy and communism, and that order and progress can only be achieved through authoritarianism. Now, let me just say something quickly, the last point. Kissinger has never been Secretary of the Treasury like George Shultz or Jim Baker. And the United States has been very lucky to have very good Secretaries of State in the last century. But there is a deeper difference. He was born in Germany of Jewish parentage. He became American, but he was less American and more American. He was less American because, can you imagine how he could have dealt with Nixon, who was a strong, virulent anti-Semite? But he was also more American because he had the additional perspective on the United States. And Jorge has already identified this in his comment. And I'll just read one quick closing sentence from an interview that Kissinger gave The Atlantic a few years ago. He said, Americans think that the normal condition of the world is stability and progress. If there is a problem, it can be removed by the mobilization of effort and resources. And when it is solved, America can return to isolation. I think there he has identified the problem the Americans face today, which is that it is important for us to learn to engage permanently in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this thorough portrait of Dr. Kissinger as a public servant. Luigi, now I shall call upon President Figueres to share with us his views on Dr. Kissinger's legacy. President Figueres holds a BA in Industrial Engineering from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a Master's in Public Administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His professional experience includes having been a very successful businessman in Costa Rica prior to becoming president of that country. In 1994, he was elected president of Costa Rica. While in office, he signed the Structural Adjustment Program with the IMF, privatized select state-owned companies, and passed the central bank law, which ended some historic monopolies of the public banking system. He has been a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General to the Information and Communication Technologies Advisory Group, now a task force since the year 2000. He has been a member of many non-for-profit organizations such as the World Resources Institute and the World Wildlife Fund. Welcome, President Figueres.
Doña Beatriz, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. I must say I have enjoyed your comments, Don Jorge. You, from a very privileged position as Foreign Minister of your country, have given us a good perspective of Henry Kissinger's role as Secretary of State. And I have to say, Ambassador Einaudi, Don Luigi, muy querido señor, that I have absolutely enjoyed your personal perspectives and experiences with Secretary Kissinger. I would like to focus, if I may, on what I would call the future thinking of Kissinger, or the Kissinger of the future. But before I get there, I would have to say that I can think of no other person that has impacted geopolitics in the last 50 years as Henry Kissinger has done so. As a national security advisor, as the Secretary of State, from many different platforms, his voice was heard, respected by some, not by others, and his Kissinger doctrine, or realpolitik, was, I would say, put into action in all corners of the world. Don Jorge has spoken about that approach in Latin America, but one can see Henry Kissinger's imprint on Europe, on the Middle East, very especially, in Africa, in the Soviet Union, China, and of course, Asia. That has led people around the world, scholars, to praise Henry Kissinger, many, and to criticize him by some others. But the Henry Kissinger of the future is the Henry Kissinger statesperson, who is now sharing his perspectives on the challenges that he sees are most pressing in the world of today. And the world of today, friends, is characterized by the following elements. Number one, we are facing the greatest geopolitical tension that we have experienced ever since the wall came down in Europe. That does not bode well for, secondly, a global economy that is not running smoothly today, and that certainly should, in terms of being able to satisfying the needs and improve the livelihoods of millions of people around the world who deserve to live a better world. Thirdly, we are facing a planetary crisis with respect to climate change and the health of the ocean, the most important ecosystem in our life. And that fight to transform our economy into a low-carbon economy, a global low-carbon economy, of course, requires cooperation and being able to work beyond the geopolitical tensions that we see today. In that world, Kissinger reminds me, at his 100th birthday, he reminds me of a saying my grandfather had, who lived to be much older than Kissinger. And Fafa, my grandfather, used to say, uno es joven mientras tenga más ilusiones que recuerdos. One is young as long as one has more illusions than remembrances. And of course, in Henry Kissinger's thoughts with respect to the future, one sees many illusions of how this world could work much better, creating a healthier and better livelihood for peoples around the world. Jorge has mentioned some of these. I will tackle them from perhaps a different perspective. Number one, Kissinger has shared generously with us in the last years, and especially very recently, his preoccupation with respect to the tremendous confrontation within the United States and the way this affects the role of the United States in the world. Certainly, there has been confrontation between the two major political parties in the US for many decades. But he points out, and with good reason, that at no other point in history has that confrontation been as bitter and as deep as it is today. And furthermore, he points out that he does not see the leadership on either side within the US to be able to walk across the aisle and find opportunities on which to work together and create a much better United States. Secondly, he is not only worried about the confrontation between China and the US, a relation which, of course, he was pivotal in starting, as has been pointed out here. But interestingly, he is concerned with the way that AI, artificial intelligence, could even create much more of a confrontation between China and the US. In other words, in a tense situation already, a tense relation, how AI, artificial intelligence, could put that tense situation on steroids, so to say, and deepen the rift between both countries. And he goes into how in the future, in the near future, machines could impose global pandemics, for example, which would require the major powers to work together. And he points out to have effective and responsible leadership that is committed to working together. His most recent book on China is an extraordinary recount, not only of Chinese history, but of the China of the last 50 or 60 years, the role it has played in the world, and the role that he believes it will play into the future. And thirdly and lastly, I would point out his perspectives with respect to the conflict in Europe, Ukraine and Russia. Interestingly enough, contrary to what Europe is holding as a position today, and what many scholars believe should be the case, he argues for Ukraine becoming a part of NATO. And he puts out very sensible arguments on why this is the best, why Ukraine should not be left out in the open as a country that is not better aligned with Europe, because of the fact that it would pose more of a risk for Europe than if it was part of NATO, and so to speak, could be not contained, but could then be invited to abide by NATO's rules. And he therefore also argues why that is the best case for Russia as well. A very interesting perspective, which is counter to what many scholars and statesmen are thinking about today. These three elements, amongst others that I point out, reflect a Henry Kissinger that at the tender age of 100 years has more illusions than remembrances, although his remembrances are vast, as he has picked up and reported in his books. And I want to celebrate that in Henry Kissinger, that at this birthday and towards the future, he continues to be the global statesman that he is, respected and praised by many, criticized by others, but always concerned with global issues and how we can make this planet a better home for humankind. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you so much, President Figueres. And now, before I give the floor to Ambassador Caucino, is there any comment that any of the panelists would like to make on the presentations of the other panelists? You have 1 minute to do so.
With global issues.
And I am asking 1 minute comment on the presentations of the other panelists. So.
Beatrice, I would only add in 30 seconds that I want to thank Don Jorge and I want to thank Don Luigi. I have learned a tremendous amount from their presentations and I have enjoyed them utterly.
Thank you so much, President Figueres. Now, I will give the floor to Ambassador Caucino. Ambassador Caucino is to deliver the closing remarks of this event.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I would like to make my congratulations to Mayor Regalado, President Figueres, former Minister Jorge Castañeda, Ambassador Einaudi, and especially to you, Dr. Beatrice Rangel, a longtime admirer of Dr. Kissinger, who made this conversation possible. I would like in these final remarks, let me point about this very important thing we are commemorating. Dr. Henry Kissinger is about to turn 100 years old, and today he is the subject of a widespread tribute all around the world. But given that it is impossible to describe his life and work in these few minutes, perhaps it is useful to emphasize some lessons from his strategic thinking. The first thing I would like to mention is his lifelong admiration of balance of power. It was conducted throughout his entire career, both in academy and in diplomacy, in which Kissinger promoted the search for stability through a framework of legitimacy, acceptable to the main actors in the system. A subject that he described in his masterpiece, written in the 1950s, A World Restored, The Politics of Conservatism in a Revolutionary Era, in which he explained the problems of the European order after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Which leads me to mention the importance of the notion of world order in Kissinger's thought and the extreme importance of studying the benefits and mistakes of international arrangements, such as the Congress of Vienna or Versailles in 1919, or 1945, or recently, the New World Order that emerged at the end of the Cold War, and which misunderstandings are maybe the main cause of today's quarrel between great powers. Another thing that we must mention is the outstanding capacity to work both in academy and high office of Dr. Kissinger, which is extremely important, the value that he attributes to history. He always mentioned a Churchill phrase, which asked by scholars what recommendation he would do to young politicians. He says, study history, history, history. And in this way, we must mention the huge intellectual efforts made by Dr. Kissinger on essays as Diplomacy, World Order, on China, and his recent book, Leadership, in which he mentions the capacity, the ability to expand national capacities to its limits. And he mentions this huge admiration of leaders, for example, as Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, or President Nixon. And last but not least, of course, we owe to Dr. Kissinger, as well, of course, of the leadership of President Nixon, the opening to China, maybe Nixon-Kissinger administration most important achievement, as well as the possibility of setting the base for a new Middle East with the accords between the State of Israel and Egypt, with the peace treaty that was completed in the following Carter administration that was started in the 70s during the Nixon and then Ford administration with the huge work of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Beatrice, thank you very much. I think it was a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to deliver these few comments in this panel. And it's a great honor for me to be in company of such important people here as President Figueres, Ambassador Einaudi, former Foreign Minister Castañeda, Mayor Regalado, and of course you, that I would like to thank you especially because I know your admiration, your friendship, and your gift about doing this in the tribute of a great statesman of this second half of the 20th century, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now we end our proceedings. Thank you to our chairman who has given us this leadership to create these programs. We invite you to tune in next on the 31st of May at 6 o'clock. We are going to have a forum on the state of human rights and political discussions in Colombia. Thank you so much and see you next week.